Welcome back to A Slice of News, where I cut you off a slice of news. The self-described president of peace who promised no more forever wars has begun to bomb Iran and launched what is likely to be yet another forever war. While the announcement that they had begun to bomb Iran and bombings had killed the Ayatollah Khomeini in Iran came as an abrupt and sudden announcement, it did not come as a surprise to anybody who was really paying attention. Despite his attempts at positioning himself as a totally anti-war peace president during the campaign leading up to the 2024 election and into the beginning of his first term, I think many never truly believed that Donald Trump did not want to start a war somewhere at some point during his second term. To many on his side of the political spectrum, including President Trump himself, view military action as a show of power, of strength. A leader that launches military actions is a strong and powerful leader, and that's exactly the image that he has tried so hard to cultivate and maintain. To many on the right, violence is strength and strength is power. And for a man I've discussed multiple times as being incredibly weak and impotent, that image of power is something he desperately wants those around him to see, and more importantly, to believe. But admittedly, it's more complex than just a power fantasy and a desire to project strength. As we've seen multiple times in just this first year of his second term, President Trump likes to do things so that it can be seen that he is doing things. He's always been a man who is very image focused and all about his personal brand. So his time in the presidency has been all about the presidential brand. So it seems he needs to do things like a military strike on Iran to really improve the look of that brand. Sure, he can rename buildings and build ballrooms here at home, but he needs some international acclaim. He can be the big, strong leader that toppled the evil Iranian regime and saved the world from their nuclear missiles. He can be seen as a hero. His predecessor, George Bush Jr., got a lot of credit for saving the world from the weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, so he wants a little bit of that, except, of course, just like George Bush's military action in Iraq, President Trump's military action in Iran really doesn't have any factual basis. George W. Bush justified going into Iraq because he said that the Iraqis had weapons of mass destruction was not proven to be true, and President Trump is saying that military action into Iran is justified that could supposedly, potentially reach the United States, which also has not been proven to be true. In a lot of ways, it feels like we are repeating 2001 all over again and seeing the exact same justifications and explanation for why military action is not only justified in the Middle East, as if we have not learned anything in the last several decades about the consequences of those types of actions. We know U.S.-backed forced regime changes do not create stability in that area because every time we've tried to do that, it has never worked. And there are numerous commonalities between the military engagements in Iraq back in the early 2000s and what we're currently starting to see in modern-day Iran. What's interesting, if interesting is even really the correct term in this case, both of those events are deeply connected to each other. In 1953, the U.S. helped topple the Iranian government headed by Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and installed the Shah of Iran to be the head of the Iranian government, who spent a few decades as an America-friendly leader who was perfectly willing to allow American oil companies to exploit Iranian oil until he was deposed in the Iranian Revolution in early 1979. But now that the U.S. has lost their puppet king in Iran, the nation under Islamic rule of the Ayatollah feels like a threat to the U.S. and its interests in that region. So they back a strongman leader in Iraq. They give him training and weapons and basically whatever he needs to fight the now incredibly anti-American Iranians. That Iraqi strongman, of course, being a man named Saddam Hussein, who once he's done fighting Iranians in the 1980s, decides to use all those military resources that the U.S. government was so kind to give him back when he was fighting their enemy, to then attack Kuwait, triggering the first Gulf War at the beginning of the 90s, and setting him up for about a decade of of brutal dictatorship in Iraq before the U.S. government decided it was time for regime change in Iraq and to depose the evil Saddam Hussein, the man who was only in power in Iraq because the U.S. government had put him there because they had given him weapons and technology to fight the Iranians, who they saw as a threat because they had deposed the guy they had put in power because they had deposed the guy who was in power before him that the U.S. didn't like because he was keeping Iranian oil away from American and British interests. So I guess all of that is a long way of saying everything that happened in Iraq in the early 2000s and what's happening in Iran today is a direct result of American interference into those countries in the past. They are both cases of us fighting a problem that we ourselves caused. Which is not to say there were not legitimate grievances with the Ayatollah-run Iranian government. But there wouldn't even be an Islamic Ayatollah-controlled Iran if the U.S. had just left the democratically elected government of Iran under Mossadegh alone and not tried to install the Shah so that they could have more Iranian oil. We wouldn't be in this mess right now. But if there's one lesson history could teach us, it's that the U.S. trying to push a regime change in the Middle East never goes well for the United States and always comes to bite them back later. If there's one seeming historical context in that region, it's that the United States always creates its own future adversaries. So in a way, because the US government in the 1950s wanted to protect oil interests in the Mideast, nearly 800 Iranians and 11 US servicemen are dead in just the last 4 days, including a school full of 180 Iranian school children, and the number of dead will only increase exponentially as this conflict continues on. Our president has the audacity to say that this conflict in Iran is to free the Iranian people from their repressive and repressive Islamic government, when it is so incredibly clear that he could not care less about the Iranian people, and this conflict is entirely about protecting American interests and appeasing Israel. I don't know who he thinks he's fooling by trotting out the old regime change in the Middle East is good, because it's never been good before and it's not going to magically become good because he is the one declaring it. President Trump and Israel's Netanyahu have the blood of nearly 1,000 people on their hands, and it's not even been a week. Outside of the typical conservative war spin, this conflict already is looking very bad, and for however long it actually lasts, the repercussions of it will last much, much longer, both in the region and, unfortunately, probably here at home as well. There have already been retaliatory actions in places like Bahrain, Qatar, Oman, and the UAE in response to the joint U.S.-Israeli attacks on Iran, and there will likely be many more, and there is now certainly an increased possibility of some sort of terrorist action here in the United States as a response to the actions in the Mideast right now. A lot of people are understandably very mad about what is happening in Iran and are likely to only get more and more angry and more radicalized and anti-American the longer this conflict lasts and the more Iranian lives are lost in it. While I highly doubt it's going to reach the level of a 9/11 Part 2, it is important to remember that 9/11 Part 1 was largely a result of and response to other American meddlings in the Mideast. And another example of America fighting a beast of its own making, since Al-Qaeda came out of the U.S. arming and training the Mujahideen to fight the Soviets in Afghanistan back in the 1980s. So while I don't think this Iranian conflict will result in a second Al-Qaeda-type terrorist group, I do feel like there is the possibility of some sort of retaliatory terrorist action on U.S. soil as a result of it, and at the very least we should be prepared for such an event. On top of the further destabilization of the region by U.S. and Israeli forces to support U.S. and Israeli interests, I can't help but feel like President Trump's decision to begin military actions in the region were at least in part for his own personal gain. It seems very obvious that despite his numerous attempts to deflect people's attention from them, the Epstein files and his deep connection to them is not going away, so it does not stretch credulity that he would literally start a war in Iran simply to distract people from the Epstein files and his connection to them and put all the nation's attention someplace else instead of on him. Am I saying President Trump is allowing American servicemen to die overseas simply so people will stop talking about Epstein? Not necessarily. But at the same time, a desperate narcissist like him certainly would if he could. So who's to say that's not exactly what he's doing? Having basic human decency and empathy is certainly not something you could ever accuse Donald Trump of possessing. I admit that's a bit of a wild swing in space, much less in fact and a lot more in conjecture. But at this point, I honestly don't think I can put anything past him. Time and time again, we say Donald Trump wouldn't. But then Donald Trump does. So honestly, who's to say what he's capable or not capable of doing, purely in the name of preserving and protecting himself? But regardless of what the true intentions and desires behind the military action in Iran has been, the reality is that far too many people have died already as a result, and far, far too many will die as a result in the future. And the repercussions of this decision will be his legacy. The scores of lives lost would be on his conscience if he had one. The reality is there is no graceful out of this. There's no way to come out of this clean and looking good. It is a taint that will stick to him for however long he has left in his time as president. History will not look back fondly on these events or his time as our leader, and that's probably as it should be. These events in Iran are certainly cementing his position as one of, if not the worst presidents in all of American history, and we will all be considerably better off once he is no longer in that position. Alright guys, that'll be it for this episode of A Slice of News. I've been your host, Mr. Slice, and until next time when I cut you off another slice of news. And don't forget to rate and review the show on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you find it.